We're recording. Hello, class. It's Christopher, as always, and I am delighted once again to bring a guest to our class, our final guest of the semester, believe it or not. And as they say, save the best for last. I'm delighted to bring back to class an author and journalist and futurist, Sil Tang, who has come to class before and has always been one of my students' favorite guests of all time. Sil is a longtime journalist who's written for the Financial Times and has also written this wonderful book, Disrobed, that some of you may have read for the assignment this week. It's called How Clothing Predicts Economic Cycles, Saves Lives, and Determines the Future. It's absolutely fascinating and brings up all sorts of things about fashion and how it's interconnected with the world in ways that you would never, ever imagine. So anyway, to get right to the point, welcome, Sil.
Thank you.
So glad to have you back in class. And if you could just give us a quick rundown of, as I say, you've written for the Financial Times and you're a futurist and a brand consultant. And if you could just give us a quick rundown about your career and what you do and how you got started and that sort of thing in a nutshell.
Well, the world has certainly changed in a year since we did this talk last year. Funny enough, my work hasn't changed all that much, but I started off, wow, let's see how long ago now. Ooh, I don't think it's quite 30 years, thank heavens. I think it might be 25 years ago. And, you know, I started working for a small consulting firm, and then I went out to go start a internet company at the time when everyone was doing that, and, you know, during the dot-com boom. And it really was a city guide before people were really doing that sort of thing, before the internet was something, and before people had a mobile device to look for places to go. And it rapidly became a consultancy because people and companies were looking for an audience. It was the first time that people were digitally connected. And then maybe about 2 or 3, not even, maybe 2 years into it, I remember getting a call from the state of Michigan. And it wasn't, you know, it's funny how when you tell the story many times, there are certain things that stand out, and each time you tell it, it's something different. But I do remember getting this call from the state of Michigan, and they were really struggling because Detroit, amongst other cities, were hemorrhaging young people and hemorrhaging talent, and people were leaving, and they wanted me to help them figure out how to hold on to, it was before the word influencer, but how to hold on to people who are contributing artistically, economically, essentially urban development, but in a way that really mattered across borders and really mattered across socioeconomic and political strata and all sorts of ways to hold on to people for the state of Michigan. And we started doing that kind of work, and it sort of bloomed into cross-border work around socio-political, geopolitical issues, economic issues, and it tied into my background. I'd had a background in economics. I was an economics major and a law minor, and specifically sociology, law, women's rights law. And so it tied into work that I had previously done. I'd taken something like 5 statistics classes, and I started consulting to companies, governments, doing that kind of work. And at the same time, I was writing articles about where the world was going. And when it came time to gather that information together, it seemed to make sense to do a book. And when I talked to people about doing a book, I originally wanted to do a much wider book about a lot of different issues, about all the different topics I'd covered. And there wasn't a unifying thread. So what happened was, because I'd been writing specifically about fashion, but not fashion the way people think about it, more about soft goods and clothing and the industry as a whole, and how it affected lots of different things, meaning murder, the economy, wearable goods, driverless cars, all kinds of things. That became the unifying theme, and eventually became Disrobed, which came out a little over 3 years ago now.
Yeah.
That's the background.
Okay. Yeah, and as I say, it's fascinating, the connections that you make with fashion, and the interconnection it makes in the world in that book. Things that you would never, ever think about before. I always bring up the topic of, you talk about the alligators and alligator skin bags going up in price after the hurricane because the alligator farms were destroyed down south. You also said that you predicted Trump's election by what people were wearing in that 2 months before it ever happened.
Months before it happened. And you know what was funny about that is originally we had a Trump chapter. So if you read the book, you'll sort of get a feeling that there's some missing pieces. And more than one person has emailed me and said, hey, I feel like there's something missing here. Did you have other parts or other bits? And I always confess and say yes. So originally we had a Trump chapter. And the publisher felt it was too nihilistic. It was too depressing. And I ended up giving their keynote address. They're in fact the largest publisher of books in the United States. And I gave their international keynote. And this is back right when he was elected. And at the end of the keynote, everyone said, wow, that was the most depressing talk we've ever had. Is there any good news? And if you think about it, that was the beginning of 2017. And I said, I'm not going to lie to you guys. I don't think there is. I think it's going to be a bad 4 years and maybe longer. Wow. And, so at the time when we went to publish the book, they didn't want to end the book on a depressing note, but because it's more or less chronological,
right?
The Trump chapter made sense to be the last chapter. It was just going to end on a terrible, they just felt they wanted it to end on a hopeful, positive note where people could take something constructive and do something better with the world.
Okay. And you said we had 4 bad years ahead of us, hence you being a futurist.
Well, I don't think it's over, unfortunately. I think that people think that, on January 20th, 2021, things will change. But, there are a lot of people in this country who voted for him. And there are a lot of people who feel the way that he tapped into something that is underlying out there. And I think to pretend that it's one person is, when he leaves office and that's everything's going to change on that day, isn't correct.
Right.
There really is something that needs to be addressed. People are very unhappy, maybe not in half the country, but certainly nearly half the country is very unhappy.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And could you just clarify, I mean, you wear many hats. You're a journalist, a writer, you're a futurist. You mentioned once that you're the only Asian woman futurist in the entire world.
Is that weird? It's surreal. I'm sure there's someone's going to pop up and say, no, there's also me. But so far, no one has contacted me on social media or email or otherwise. And it can sometimes be very lonely. I was tapped for a London group wanted me to speak, and they couldn't decide which group to put me in, and then ultimately they ended up not inviting me because I was, funny enough, the only minority. And I thought to myself, wow, this is last year, the year before, I think, no, it was last year, early 2019. I thought to myself, you'd rather not have any minorities instead of having someone who would stand out.
Right.
And so I do think it's still lonely out there. And I think while there are glass ceilings being shattered all over the place, there's a lot of work to be done.
Wow. Okay, great. And also, this class today in particular is about revisions, which is a huge part of the journalistic and writing process. Right. And you mentioned to me, how many revisions did you do on this book? I know.
Oh, good heavens. Let's see. How many? I think our final count was 46.
Yeah.
I don't remember. It was so many. It was,
yes.
it was just so many versions of just rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. And that was actually before it started, before it got to the publisher.
Okay. What are your hints for revising, and what is the process?
I think the most important thing about being a journalist, and not just about being a journalist, but being in business or doing anything where you are documenting what is happening in the world or trying to convey a message to other people, is to make sure, especially today, is to make sure that you're not only projecting what you believe and what you think. Right now, the ability to critically think, and we see with fake news online and how people believe hoaxes and they forge chain letters, that people aren't thinking before they hit publish. They aren't thinking before they hit send. We need to take a step back and think about the information that is being given to us. Is it accurate? What is the source? How reliable is the data that you're receiving? How many people, if you hear something as a study, how many people were in the study? Who funded the study? How long was it done for? Has it been peer reviewed? Is it rigorous? And so forth. And so I think when it comes to revisions and writing, that's something that we have to do. We have to ask ourselves whether our thoughts are just our thoughts. Is it opinion? Is it actually fact? If it is a fact, who backs that fact? You should really have a lot of sources before you put something in writing. You should know whether you're putting forward just your own thoughts or whether you're putting forward other people's thoughts, whether or not it has reliable data. And then when you are revising, it makes sense to go back and double check that and triple check that and quadruple check that.
Right, for sure. Also too, I know that you are a bit of a master of social media and promotions.
I am? That's news to me.
I would say so. Okay, well, maybe that's not a fact, but.
I don't know. I think it's moved on. I don't have any TikTok videos.
Okay. Well, how important would you say is the role of social media in journalism and or fashion, period?
Well, now it's very important because at the time that I was leaving the newspaper industry to write my book was around the time, I think maybe 2 years earlier or even a year earlier, was the time that Alexander McQueen had his first virtual show. And, the fashion industry, when I say the fashion industry, I don't actually mean the manufacturers and the designers. I mean sort of the old conglomerates, old luxury companies were very slow to pick up on that, very slow to pick up that runway shows wouldn't be the way that things would be done forever, and to pick up on online. And, they were dragged kicking and screaming all the way to New Age. And there's been a fair amount of influencers are something that people have had to contend with very reluctantly because they managed to get a footprint online and do quite a huge volume of sales before the luxury companies ever thought to pay any attention to them.
Right.
So I think that it's about the medium. Social media is a medium like any other. It's whether it's print or online or a book, or there are lots of different ways to communicate, and those things change and they evolve, and it's about how you use it. So just like anything else, there's social media that's totally worthless, and there's social media that is really meaningful and useful.
Okay. Can you name one of the latter? Is there one that impresses you?
I think the ability for social media and this has unfortunately nothing to do with fashion, but I think the ability for social media to get political messages out there, to raise awareness of, you look at the power of, say, GoFundMe, and the ability for people to crowdsource huge amounts of funds for things that they care about, or to get out the vote in areas. You look at what's happening with Georgia right now with the election, the runoff that's
right.
coming up in early January. That huge amount of that was through word of mouth. Mm-hmm. And through the power of networking. And a lot of that was through people talk about that grassroots canvassing that happened. This is so terrible because I'm embarrassed to forget the name of the organization that was really behind it. But a lot of that was through social media. They channeled digital media in order to make that happen. They got out the vote that way.
Okay, great. And what are your thoughts on the state of fashion and, more importantly, fashion journalism these days?
I think it's a changing world. I think that people have been extremely distracted by everything that's going on. And I think that when you talk about fashion journalism in a year where people are dying and suffering at such great volumes, where people are still, as we speak today, there are hospitals all over the country just filled to capacity. I think a number of places have dropped below 15% in their ICUs and have had to lock down. So, when you talk about fashion journalism in the context of that, it feels frivolous. It feels, it feels, you can't really compare the two. But ultimately, I think that we will turn a corner, I hope, in that, and while I will tell you that this is not going to be the last pandemic, rather unfortunately, I think there are others coming. This was not the first.
Right.
This is not the first I've experienced in my lifetime. I think this is the third behind the first SARS and MERS. But I think that fashion journalism has a role because it not only does it allow industry to keep moving forward, it allows economies to keep going. And you look at restaurant workers, and they're certainly getting a lot more attention right now than fashion is. But fashion employs people. We're still wearing clothes. You're still having you still have to put clothes on. But there is also, funny enough, a hybrid that has come through in recent times, and no one's calling it fashion. They wouldn't call it fashion. They call it PPE.
Right.
There's a role of protective gear, and in my book I talked a little bit about the role of protective gear in avalanches and in hurricanes, and the ability of wearables to save lives. And now we're really seeing
Right.
that happen. So we're really seeing how masks, and I read a very interesting article that's written entirely from the perspective of someone in the West. Maybe because I'm Chinese, when I have gone overseas and gone to Asia, masks are everywhere.
Yeah.
It's not a political issue. It's not an issue for debate. Everyone's got one on. And for years, when people would come over, when Asian people would walk the streets fully masked up in New York, New Yorkers would look at them like, you're a crazy person. And now
The one time I went to Japan, I bought masks as a souvenir because I thought it was so cute.
Yes, because it was so unusual.
Yeah.
And, there's a whole thing that's happening in France where, the issue of laicite that I talk about in my book has become an issue now because they don't know. They want to wear masks. They don't know whether they should wear masks. It's an issue of freedom. Do you cover your face? Do you cover your neck? Do you cover your eyes? So there is the role of covering that kind of, it's not fashion per se.
Right.
It's not, we're not talking about Louis Vuitton. We're talking about things that people are wearing. But those cultural issues have really risen to the forefront, and people are talking about them.
Right.
What are those cultural clashes? What does it mean? How do we reconcile? If you had told me that someone would think a piece of fabric was, such a lightning point in the United States a year ago, I funny enough, I talk about it in my book.
Yeah.
I say that it's coming to the shores, that we are going to be arguing about these face cloths. But if you told me it was going to be an N95, I mean, I knew that face coverings were going to be, there's a section where I talk about how face coverings are going to be something we are going to argue about in the US. And
Yes.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Here we are.
That was your chapter about burqas, but it was, yeah.
Yep.
Yep. And you talked about technical fashion and stuff too. I remember at class a couple of semesters ago, you came in and I thought it was brilliant talking about how tracking devices will be used for seniors who have Alzheimer's and who might wander off.
Yes. That's really, so you see now that there are a number of companies now that have safety jewelry for women to press for an alert, and they look like bracelets, they look like jewelry, they don't look like those, I've fallen and I can't get up kind of alerts. And so that has become its own industry unto itself. And I think that people are using those tracking devices not just to track seniors who might wander, who have Alzheimer's or dementia, but who they're in certain countries, they use it for contact tracing.
Right.
So, there's obviously the great divide between, you have your cell phone. So if you really want to turn on the contact tracing in your cell phone, you don't need an extra device for someone to track you, but maybe you want that tracing to be available to certain people and not others, and so forth.
Okay, right. Okay, and I'm going to wrap up here, but final question, what is the best advice that you've ever gotten from an editor or a colleague or somebody that you've ever worked with as far as journalism and writing goes? And what would your advice be to the class for people who are pursuing?
Best advice.
Mhm.
Every year I have to think about this question because it's been a year and I've gotten
Okay.
other advice. I think that right now, maybe if I had, and maybe because of the year that we have all experienced, I would say that it is important to look at the future and think about how we can do better. There is always, it is important for us at this point in time, because everything is digital, not to say things that are callous, mean, that we cannot take back, things that may be damaging. We have now, with interconnectivity, the ability to do more damage than we ever did before. So I think when people are writing and thinking about what it is they're going to put out into the world, they really have to be responsible. And I have always felt that way about the things that we write, but now more than ever, because now with the way things are going, we really do hold people's lives in our hands. You know, if you look at that situation with the woman in the park who called the police on the bird watcher.
Right.
And I think that may or may not have anything to do with fashion, but everything comes back to when you put something in writing, and when you write something, and when you say something, you have to own your words. And I think because, you know, I'm older now, you know, I'm probably 25 years older, more, if not more, than the kids in your class. I have the benefit of looking back and thinking to myself, wow, I was not very clever when I said that. So if someone had said to me 25 years ago, watch what you say, be kind online, be nice to other people, know that you have power in your words at any age, and you just really don't know who you're affecting with what you put out there. So think before you hit publish.
Oh, love it. Excellent advice, but especially in this day and age, for sure.
In this day and age.
For sure. Anyway, anything else? Have I missed anything? Do you want to discuss any other topics? Or
no, I don't think so. I hope that next year we'll be able to meet in person.
Yes.
And fingers crossed that things start to get better.
Well, as always, thank you so much for visiting class, and good luck with the rest of the year, and see you in 2021.
And to your students too, and to you.
Okay.
See you next year.
Hey, thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.